Hello everybody, my name's Sarah Bond and I'm the Director of the Diversity and Inclusion Council here at Conference Board, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a book discussion series brought to you by Conference Board. Today I'm going to be sitting down with Veronika Hucke to talk with her about her new book, Fair Leadership. Veronika's
Hi, Sarah.
Hello, Veronika. Great to have you with us. Veronica's an experienced diversity and inclusion leader with a deep knowledge of change management and communications. She's an author, a speaker, and she's a former member of the Diversity and Inclusion Council here at Conference Board. And yes, welcome, Veronika. It's really brilliant to have you here with us. Thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So, Veronika, the book is called Fair Leadership, and I have to say I really enjoyed reading it. It seemed to me that the book tried to achieve two things. In fact, does achieve two things. First of all, it's a really practical guide for leaders and for managers about how to integrate or embed or mainstream inclusion in day-to-day work. And secondly, it's a meta-study, really. It's a meta-study gathering together lots of research and insights on diversity and inclusion and presenting them in really accessible ways. And I want to explore some of those things with you as we go through. But I guess my first question to you, Veronika, is what do you mean by fair leadership? What does that phrase mean to you? And how is it the same as or different from the phrase which I'm more familiar with, which is one around inclusive leadership?
Mm-hmm. Well, personally, I must admit, I don't really like the term inclusive leadership because it seems to indicate that there could also be exclusive leadership. But if one is not able to connect to different people and provide equal opportunities, no matter who they are, that is simply a lack of leadership, and it is bad management. It means you're not making good use of a team of individual people and the contributions they can make. So in essence, it's a waste of resources. Also, I find that many leaders actually struggle to understand what inclusive is supposed to mean. They don't necessarily know what kind of behaviors it requires. And so in my experience, fair is a much more clear-cut term that different people can relate to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I would absolutely agree with you that the language of fair leadership has a nice sort of directness about it. And one of the things I noticed early on in the book is that you define leading fairly as being about adapting the environment and leadership behaviour to meet the needs of others in the organisation. But on the other hand, often, I hear that leading fairly is understood as treating everybody the same. So you seem to be saying leading fairly or fair leadership's about treating people differently, recognising their differences. And I wonder, what would you say to leaders who say, no, leading fairly is about treating everybody in the same way?
Well, I think the first step is really to recognise that we usually don't even treat people the same, no matter whether they might also have different needs. Even if we want to be fair or treat people equally, usually biases, unconscious biases and stereotypes impact our behavior and our judgment. So who someone is, aspects like gender, origin, age, or social class impact the opportunities they have. And if we are not in the same situation as the other person, we tend to be blind to that effect. And that's why we must be aware, or I must be aware of the factors that could impact my judgment and that could prevent me from fair treatment. And then I must find ways to address them.
So just to be clear, so fair leadership's about leaders understanding difference, understanding their own, orientation or perspective towards difference, and then responding to that, to the needs of different people. Is that right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the needs of different people obviously can also mean that I need to provide them with different support.
Yes.
If somebody doesn't have English as a native language, for example, very often it's harder for them to contribute in full to a discussion. Yet, often it results in people believing that they might be less competent, less engaged. Yeah. So I need to find ways to give them a chance to speak and the safety to voice their opinions. Yeah. And that's just one simple example.
Yeah, great. And can you give us a couple of examples of sort of great fair leadership? I mean, either from your own experience of working in business, Veronika, or that you came across as you were writing the book?
Well, generally, when I see leaders behaving fairly, very often they first dare to listen, to not believe that they know it all, have all the answers, but really ask. And also, in that case, often admit vulnerabilities, and because which can come across as weakness. And so you need to dare be open to that. You must be open to being criticized, and in a way exploring uncharted territory, which can be frightening, but it also promises great rewards. So for me, that is what great leadership is about. I mean, being open, being vulnerable, and daring to try something new, and trust people and get to know people that you might not immediately relate to.
Yeah, so very sort of relational skills, really, as you say, daring to listen,
Absolutely.
Willing to have difficult conversations, willing to put yourself as a leader in a place of vulnerability and uncertainty. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I really liked about the book was the way in which it seemed to be so infused by your own experience of work. I mean, every chapter begins with scenarios which feel really sort of real, and I have to also say very familiar from my own experience. And also, I really liked that you share your experience. There was an example of you talking about being under pressure to go along to a lap dancing club at one point in your career. And I also really appreciated the tips at the end of the chapter, which were so sort of clear and pragmatic and direct. And I got this real sense that you've worked in an office. I mean, I know you have, and you know, you've seen what goes on. And I was wondering, to what extent did your experiences really inform the writing of this book?
It did so massively. And actually, I've wondered whether I should include that lap dance example, especially actually in the English version. I was less concerned about the German version. I was more concerned about the English one. But generally, my own experience informed the writing in two ways. On the one hand, I have worked inside large corporations for over 20 years. So I really know them well and how they function and the everyday experiences. And I'm glad that resonates and comes across in those entry scenes. Also, I've got nowadays many discussions with clients, and I do a lot of diversity inclusion audits to understand what can create barriers in organization. And so I've got a good sense of those themes and the challenges that need to be addressed. And that's why I've written the book. In essence, to help leaders, whether they are first-time managers or senior executives, to deal with situations and to master situations that they are very likely to experience.
And I think it really talks to, as I say, the day-to-day experience of managers and leaders, and is great for that. I mean, one of the reasons that I was really keen to to talk to you on this podcast, Veronika, was because, there are lots of books being written on diversity and inclusion at the moment, but not so many, or at least not so many that I'm aware of, that are written from a European perspective. Most tend to be English language, coming out of the US or the UK. And this book, you first published the book in German, and I was really interested about what the book might say that's different from what's been written before, because it comes from a European perspective. And I just wanted to explore that with you. And really to ask you, what do you see as the main differences in the way that diversity and inclusion are approached in Europe versus, say, North America? And maybe what do European leaders, perhaps listening to this podcast, need to be aware of when it comes to doing diversity in Europe that may be different from the US or the UK? I know those are big questions, but I'm just really curious about this very important European perspective that you're bringing, and through first writing this book in German.
Well, actually, I think one aspect that differentiates the book from books originally published in English is probably that I'm making more use of resources and research that was not originally in English, which broadens the perspective. Though generally I'd shy away from saying this is a European perspective. I find it quite funny, actually, that you speak about UK and Europe.
It's just on my mind.
I think most of us would still consider the UK, even after Brexit, as part of Europe.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's also such huge differences within Europe and European countries and wherever you look. And so I think it's important to read books that come from a different angle, that are written by people that have a different kind of upbringing, that have different origins, that come from different cultures, because that is going to impact their view and their experiences and the way they see the world. And so just recognizing that there's these different views and different experiences is important to get that understanding and to build that understanding.
I mean, go on, Veronika, sorry.
There's one more thing that I think really differentiates my book from a lot of other D&I books that have been written, and which has got nothing to do with me being German. And that is that I've written this book for leaders. I mean, from the start with my publisher, we've decided that this is not supposed to be a D&I book, because that kind of makes it always a niche topic. But it is a leadership book, and it's positioned as a leadership guide, because being able to work successfully with different people is a key leadership skill today. Yeah. And that was really the intention for the book. And for me, it's a very, very important distinction from other literature in that field.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I mean, in terms of working with different people, one of the things I enjoyed in your book was about your insights as a German speaker into what Brits, as you say, and what Germans would understand from what's being said. And you've got some great examples of some of this. So you give an example of where Brits might say, "and by the way," as they get into the sort of main point of a conversation. I mean, I'm sure I'm guilty of that as well. And what German people understand is, this doesn't really matter. It's a kind of adjunct to the main conversation. But what British people mean, and what Germans would say if they were to say it themselves, is, listen up, this is actually the main point that I want to make. And I really recognise those examples that you gave from my own experience. And on the other hand, there's always a risk of stereotyping. You know, when we use those kinds of examples and we say, this is what Brits say and this is what Germans understand, there's always a risk of stereotyping. And I wondered what advice you would give to leaders who want to enable their teams to work together better cross-culturally and want to be able to draw on the truth of those kind of characterizations without going into stereotypes. What would you say to leaders about that? How to manage that tightrope, I suppose?
I believe it is really important to actually, or to initially become aware of different national cultures. And there is a lot of research out there that really helps to understand that there is aspects that people that have got the same origin are more likely to have in common. I mean, they're obviously not all the same, but there's trends that that you've got a certain worldview, that you've got certain values, that some things are more important to you than others. And so become aware of there is differences across people. Become aware of where do I stand? So how do I tend to behave? And is that aligned, whether it's aligned with my own culture, national culture, or whether it isn't? And how could others behave? And how can I come across? And I mean, really just have that awareness of different people. And I've touched upon it in my book to really introduce a couple of frameworks. I mean, some areas in which, well, for example, the British and the Germans really tend to differ. And Germans, for example, I mean, tend to be, compared to almost any other nationality, super direct and extremely open with criticism, which comes across not at all well in many other cultures. And so if you don't understand this kind of issues, it will create barriers for you and the people you work with at some stage. And I said, I mean, I touched upon it, but I mean, one of the books that I love in that field is The Culture Map by Irene Meyer. And everybody who wants to dig deeper into that topic, I mean, that's a book that I'd highly recommend.
Yes, yeah, no, it is a great book, and I would echo you in recommending that. Listen, we're just going to take a short break for some announcements now, and we will be back again in a few minutes to continue the conversation with you, Veronika, about your book, Fair Leadership.
Looking for additional business insights in this subject area and beyond this podcast? Go to tcb.org/EU and explore our Economy, Strategy and Finance Centre. Uncover a large array of products hosted by the Conference Board in focus areas like global economy, labour markets and many others. Products include peer-to-peer networking events, expert briefings, publications, data and analysis, webcasts, videos and blogs.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to our conversation with author Veronika Hucke about her new book, Fair Leadership. Veronika, one of the things that I really enjoyed and was intrigued by in your book was about a comment that you made about the pros and cons of social media. And you had this really interesting thought about the use of Twitter as a space in which people can make a positive difference on inclusion by, liking and echoing and amplifying things, versus the use of LinkedIn, where your observation was that basically people connect to people who are very much like themselves. And again, just, exploring this question of advice to leaders, I'm wondering what advice you would give to those leaders who want to use social media to increase inclusion or fairness. What sorts of things should they be doing? I mean, what suggestions would you have for them about the potential and the possibility of social media?
I believe Twitter is a great tool to gain insight into other people's lives and into their experiences. And we tend to surround ourselves with people who are pretty much like us. And reaching out to people who are very different can be difficult. And so what I do on Twitter is I make a point out of following people who are very different from myself, and I follow the people they follow, to get a better idea and even some almost real life virtual experience on the challenges they experience. On the one hand, because they might share about it, but also because I see the comments they get. I mean, the experience they share, I mean, how they're being reacted to. And very often, I mean, you can really see live discrimination happening there online on Twitter. And in that case, it's an easy way to, just step in, respond, show support, push back on people who are unfair. and really get a better understanding of what goes on, why is it an issue, but also what can I do, how can I react, what do people say, how they'd like you to react. I mean, you can even ask about that and get advice. And this way, practicing to actually have the same kind of interventions in real life.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I'm also aware that there are some Twitter handles that are directed towards leaders and, provide advice on fair leadership or inclusive leadership. There's one that I've really been enjoying called Better Allies. I don't know if you've come across it, Veronika, but it's it's really good actually. It's regular advice to leaders on the sort of small steps that they can take to make a difference. Things like, demanding diverse shortlists for recruitment, etc. So I do think that there's real potential there. Towards the end of the book, you talk explicitly about gender, and actually gender's a sort of recurrent theme throughout the book. And you explain the focus on gender in terms of the volume of available research. So you say that's where most of the data's available, and it's also what most organisations and most leaders are focused on. But at the same time, both you and I know that approaches on gender are becoming much more nuanced, much more aware of the reality of different people's lives. Intersectionality is an issue, paying attention to ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation as they intersect with gender. And I'm wondering, what the book would say to leaders who are interested to better understand intersectionality. What sort of advice would you be giving to leaders there?
Well, I believe it's really important to understand that concept, to recognize that all of us have things in common with some people that differentiate us from others. And that can be factors like the color of our skin, of our gender, age, socio-demographic status. And one version tends to improve your opportunities, and the other often has a negative impact. So, for example, it's usually easier to be white than black and rich than poor, having a good education versus no formal training. And intersectionality means that people combine several of the characteristics, just like you explained, that tend to make one's life harder. And they are probably faced with more than just one barrier. And so it's important to understand and to address all of them in order to create equal grounds.
And how can you help leaders see those differences? I mean, I'm just thinking about whether often leaders are just unaware of those differences and the impact on somebody's experience. What would help? How can they be brought more to leaders' attention, do you think?
Well, generally I agree that very often they are. And that's one of the discussions that I regularly have with clients and with D&I practitioners who tell me that they invest a lot of time in speaking to people one-on-one to really do individual coaching for leaders within the organization to increase awareness, to increase understanding, and then help them understand the actions that they can take. And in a way, this was a need that I wanted to address with my book. I mean, to really create awareness that discrimination or unfairness happens in everyday situations, and to depict them in those entry scenes to show very often it's not about anything that looks massive and scandalous from the outside. Very often the issues is with things that we don't even give a second thought to. And so really talk to different people, understand the experience, don't go about immediately to explain away why what you did is okay or why somebody has misread a situation. Because in the end, if someone feels this was not fair or I've been discriminated against, that is their reality. And it deserves to be taken serious because it will impact how they feel, how they react, and what they do. And in the end, if somebody feels I'm not being treated fairly, they will disengage, they are more likely to leave, they are less likely to deliver outstanding results. So whether you believe they are right or they are not, it doesn't really matter. I mean, you just have to become aware and talk to them, understand, listen.
Yeah,
read my book.
Yeah, great advice. Listen, I wanted you to talk to me about something that comes very near the end of the book, where you talk about the queen bee syndrome, which is this very prevalent view that women sort of pull the ladder up after them, to mix my metaphors, rather than help each other. I mean, that's never been my experience, and yet, as you say, it's a really prevalent story. And I'm wondering how true it is really, and why it continues as this, in inverted commas, truth, and quite a sort of destructive truth, really. What's your experience about that?
Well, I mean, what I've found from the research, because it was also something that I've worked with fabulous women, and I've talked to a lot of women that have also worked with fabulous women. And so I was interested to really go back and exactly look at what you say. I mean, why is it a theme? Why is it something that's still being discussed? And what I found interesting is that the researchers who coined that phrase actually complain that they were being misinterpreted from the very start. What they actually meant to say, or what they found, is that women who work in an essentially hostile environment are likely to hinder or can hinder the advancement of other women, because they are afraid that the ones coming after them are going to hurt their own position. So it was a very, very specific behavior shown in a specific situation in an organization. But still, rather than changing the situation in the organization, we seem to have a discussion of blaming women and putting the blame, back on them. And it's just something that we should stop doing.
So that's intriguing. So it's actually a comment about the context in which women operate, and it's been turned into a sort of criticism of how senior women operate. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. And what we shouldn't forget is that, I mean, all of us, even if you've had once a bad experience with a woman as a woman, I mean, number one is really to consider, very often women are judged against different standards because of gender stereotypes. So would I have judged that same situation if it had been a man the same way? Or would I remember it that much and pull it up again if it had been a man? And I believe in the end, we just need to remember that this discussion stalls progress, and that it plays to the hands of people who want to keep things just the way they are, because it gives them an easy way out. Blame women.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Veronika, for joining us on the podcast today. Before we finish, actually, I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions more broadly about the things that you're reading now, and the books that have inspired you. And I wondered, do you have any suggestions to share with listeners to this podcast about the books you're reading or that have inspired you? Well,
I mean, I've just finished a book called Herkunft, and I don't know whether it's Origin, by Sasha Stanišić, and I don't know whether it's been translated yet. It's fabulous. I mean, the author was born in former Yugoslavia and came to Germany during the war and lived here ever since. And what really resonated with me in that book was the way he shares about his experience as a refugee, which was very insightful, and also, I mean, makes me consider the stereotypes and biases that I hold, and as somebody who's lived in a peaceful country all their life, and cannot necessarily relate to the experience that people have that are fleeing to the country or fleeing their home countries today. Also, I read a lot of non-fiction. I mean, I just like the learning. And one of my finds actually during my own writing was a book called The Misinformation Age. The Misinformation Age: How False Beliefs Spread. And it's really fascinating to see also the impact of social media on just distorting the truth and making people believe in something that actually is simply not true. So also that.
Who was the author of that, Veronika? The Misinformation.
That's Kate O'Connor, and I would have to look up.
Okay. No worries.
Cool.
No worries. Thank you. Thanks, Veronika. And thanks to everyone else listening into the podcast. We've been talking to Veronika Hucke about her book, Fair Leadership, which you can buy from Amazon. I think that's right. Is available on Amazon and no doubt from all other good bookshops. And I'd really encourage you to get a copy. If you enjoyed this episode and listening in and enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe to Conference Board's Off the Shelf discussion podcast series, or you can explore the entire catalogue of Conference Board's podcast programming by visiting our website on tcb.org/podcasts. Veronika, thanks ever so much indeed for taking the time to speak with us today, and very good luck with your book, which has only recently been launched, so is genuinely hot off the press to listeners of today's podcasts. Thanks very much indeed.
It is, and thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed our discussion.